last month when I was talking about flow, I very much glossed over what I think is actually the most difficult part of setting up that whole setup, and also is just very useful to use in general, and that's how to set up a Charles proxy to work with HTTPS traffic, which actually can be pretty annoying to do if you aren't as familiar with working with Charles proxy and HTTPS traffic on Android. So I thought I'd just do a really brief kind of cover that topic that I just glossed over, so it's such a high level. So I'll go ahead and do that. Just a second, let me share. So first things first, I'm going to talk a little bit about, so if you're using Charles proxy and you've got it set up to listen to your endpoint based on your app, and you see something like this, it's often either it's an image or it's because it's using HTTPS and is encrypted, and this is not very useful because you can tell there's been a call, but other than that, you're kind of out of luck. So I wanted to talk a little bit about why that is. So basically, we mentioned last time that Charles works via a man-in-the-middle attack. So it gets all the requests in, it sends the requests into the server sends the response back to Charles, and then the response goes back to your client. That's wonderful, except for the fact that Android in general wants to stop that from happening, because if that happens too easily, then attackers can see your data. So I wanted to talk about how we can set up Charles to kind of get around that problem. So in order to understand that, I wanted to just briefly cover a little bit about how TLS works. So when we're working with HTTPS, which is often TLS, we kind of work with a handshake. So the client will send to the server and say hello. The server will send back, okay, hey, this is the certificate, and I agree to your hello, and this is how we're going to be doing our encryption. And then they'll exchange the session key, and then you use that session key to encrypt the traffic. Now, kind of what is the key part of that for what I'm about to talk to is the fact that you need an SSL certificate. And how do we get an SSL certificate? Well, in real everyday, like when you're using your apps in real life, how it kind of happens is you have this idea of certificate authorities and the trust hierarchy. And a certificate authority is just a company, and that company kind of does the hard work to actually confirm, like say I want to register jennifermcgee.com. It does the hard work to actually confirm that I am Jennifer McGee. Like I have an address and I pay the money, and they actually physically confirm that I'm Jennifer McGee. Now maybe they don't see me in person, but they also confirm that I'm the only one who's registering jennifermcgee.com. So your certificate authority handles that for you. And then how we generally get those different certificate authorities is, well, let me back up a little bit. So generally, one certificate authority will have something called a root cert, and we don't have a root cert for all the different like jennifermcgee.coms. What will happen is that root cert will be from the certificate authority to say I am the certificate authority, and that certificate authority will then kind of create a tree whereby it then uses that root cert to kind of say, okay, this is correct, and this is real, and this is real, and this is real. And then when you're working with things, like when you're using your phone every day, these root certificates come kind of pre-installed, either with your browser, or if you're using an Android phone, they come pre-installed on the phone. There's just a whole bunch of them. They're in the settings. It's really nice that in Android, you can kind of, if you see those sliders, you can turn them off, although you should be a little careful doing that. But if you do know that something has been compromised, you can do that. Now, in order to be able to make Charles work, it's kind of important to know that there is another kind of way to add a certificate to your phone. And that is these things called user certificates. So that's what we're going to be doing in order to make Charles be able to successfully perform the man-in-the-middle attack. Basically, you're to say, hey, I own the device. I certify that, no, I really do want to say that this guy can say that the traffic is good and that they really are who they say they are. And then we kind of give them our own certificate and say, okay, we are certifying that this is correct. So that's the basics of what we're trying to do. Now, one thing I didn't do last time that I really thought would be useful that I wanted to go ahead and give you guys, you won't need it directly for this talk, but I do think it's useful if you want to kind of try out these things at home, if you want to try out using Charles and you don't necessarily have an app to just work with. I went ahead and dug up for you an existing open source app. It's for weather. It's called Forecasty. It's open source. You can get it. It's already set up. It took me like 10 minutes to get it up and running. So if you want to play with this, that's what I would suggest. Also, my examples will be using Forecasti. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. Okay. So let's talk about how we get this Charles root certificate onto our Android device. The first thing is, if you go into Charles, it has this really helpful, if you go to help, SSL proxying, you say install Charles root certificate on the mobile device, it will bring up directions for you. And these are very nice, and they include the IP address that you need to set up your emulator or your device to proxy to. It includes what port you're using and all this kind of stuff. So you have to have your proxying set up on your device or your emulator before you do this. And then once you've got that set up, then you can kind of follow these steps. So you're following these steps. The steps change a little bit depending on what version of Charles sometimes, I think. Kind of the reason why this, and we'll talk about this a little later, why this continues to be kind of an ongoing problem that is not as easy to just search for online. You can search for it, but as Android versions get, increased and as time passes, Android becomes more and more secure, which makes this setting up your Charles to successfully perform a man-in-the-middle attack get more difficult. So let's go ahead and look at this. So this is how I'm on the emulator in this case, and this is how I'm setting up my proxying, just so that you can kind of see that part. So that's going. So once that's happened, then once it's connected to Charles, you go ahead and go to that Charles Pro /SSL, and it will download the certificate for you. Now this is a fresh device, a fresh emulator, so there's going to be a few extra steps. I wanted to show you those steps just so that if you're also using a fresh emulator, you're not like, hey, what's going on here? If it doesn't happen, obviously, then that's fine. So you name your certificate, and then you go ahead and say you're going to save it, but you're going to still have to do a few more things. You need a lock screen and just a couple more steps. You may not have all of these steps when you set it up, but I did want to display them. So setting up the PIN, and setting up lock screen. Notifications. And then you will get this little thing saying, hey, your Charles cert is installed. Now, one gotcha that I have encountered that I just did want to mention is go ahead and go to that user cert setting and make sure that it actually has shown up. I occasionally have had the device, especially the emulator, tell me that a cert is installed, but actually they've given me the pop-up, but the cert has not shown up in the user certifications. So just don't necessarily take its word for it. Definitely go check your user certifications and make sure that you can see your cert. In this case, your Charles cert. Okay, so you've done all that. And then, so you no longer now you're past the step where your cert is wrong, but now you try and do it, and you still get this particular error, which is saying SSL proxying is not enabled for this host. The first error we would have gotten would have been this certificate is not recognized. So there's a couple more steps that we need to take in Charles in order to make this work. And that's just, we have to go into the SSL proxy settings in Charles and set up the just where we want to hit and just say, yes, go ahead and proxy that. It used to work that you could just use ***. That does not work anymore. I had a very bad day before I figured that out. So just as a warning, you're going to have to say the actual endpoint that you're trying to hit. *** does not work. And now I want to talk a little bit about what you need to do in your Android app to make this work at all. So this is already pre-set up for you in the example app that I've given you, or that I didn't write it, but the example app that I've referenced you to, but I did think it was worth mentioning. You actually also need to set up a network security config, because by default, in order to support security, Android does not let apps use your user certificates. So you have to go ahead and set up this network security config and configure it to use user certificates. In addition, you have to add the network security config to your Android manifest, and you also have to be running the app in debug. So if you look over here in my build variants, I've got build variants set to debug down here in the lower left. I think by default, when you're running an app, it will be in debug probably, but that's worth checking. So does anybody have any questions about that before I move on to one additional little gotcha? No, okay. So I did want to mention one other thing that has recently come up. So there is currently a bug in how the emulator works with Charles. And I wanted to go ahead and thank Jared Stockton, one of my coworkers, who kind of clued me in how to work with this. But this is to get the emulator fully working with Charles is really painful. But I wanted to at least outline the basic steps for you, and they'll be kind of in detail in the slides, which I will post on the group. So let's go ahead and talk about that. So if you're trying to get the emulator to work, first of all, when you're working with the emulator, you won't see the nice names for the hosts. You will just see the full, like the whole number, which is unfortunate. But there are some ways to get around this. So the first thing you can do is you can go ahead and create your own self-signed cert. I believe the Charles cert may possibly be being blocked. I'm not 100% sure why this works. I just do know that it does work. So you can go ahead and create your own root certificate. These are just steps for creating your root certificate. Any way of creating a root certificate should work, but I just wanted to give you steps in case you wanted to do it yourself. I thought about providing you guys a root certificate, but I decided that might be a little bit too tempting from a security standpoint. So these are the steps to create your own root certificate. Now, in order to get the cert on the emulator, there's several different ways to do that, but I've only had not all the ways to get the cert on the emulator actually worked for me for installing the cert. One thing that I did find that did work was to go ahead and put it on the SD card and then use the install from SD card function. Now, to get it onto the SD card, you can, of course, use your command line tools. If you want to use the GUI, this File Device Explorer that's built into Android Studio is actually pretty nice. It's pretty easy to work with. The only real gotcha is it seems like you should be able to drag and drop into your SD card section. That does not work. You need to right click. It took me probably 15 minutes the first time I tried to do this, being like, why is it not working? What am I supposed to do? The answer is you need to right click and then you can say upload. Okay, so once you've got your cert and it's on your device, I wanted to kind of show you adding it to your settings. So this is going to be, this will also show you just the settings regarding the cert, which is nice. So you go to encryption and credentials, then you go to install from SD card. I put mine in my downloads. So there it is. I'm naming it just like last time. Okay, so it's been named and it has been installed. So that should be, hopefully that will work for you. But there is another step we need to do. So in Charles, by default, it uses the cert that you get from that get SSL Charles Pro / get SSL cert. You need to change that. You need to go ahead and now make Charles use your root cert. This is more secure in general, so that's one additional benefit of doing this setup. It's not that hard, but you do need to go into the settings and choose root cert. And when you created that cert, there will be a few different files that are created. I would suggest uploading the P12 file that was created during that process. One gotcha that I did want to mention is that we have seen stopping the SSL proxy before it goes sometimes makes it work better. And sometimes you need to kill Charles and reopen it in order to be able to make it recognize the new cert. So this is a very fiddly process, very fiddly, but you can go ahead and test it after this. And the good news is once you've got it set up once it works, it will work forever because it's on emulator. So you don't have to do anything with it. It just works, which is great, but it can take a while to set up the first time. If all of that still does not work for you, there's one more thing you can try, and it's also just good to know in general that you can do it. And that is you can go ahead and configure Charles to proxy not only network traffic, but you can configure it to proxy your mobile data, or as it say on there, the APN. So that's just you go to your settings, network and internet, mobile network, You used to be able to copy your access point names. Access point would be like T-Mobile or whatever, but you can no longer do that. However, you can just create a new one and you just can use the same data as is in the other one. But the important part is set the proxy to your IP address for Charles and the port to your port 8888. Then you go to toolbar, you click save, and you save your access point, and you should be ready to go. It's a very involved process, but when you're banging your head against the wall trying to get Charles to work with your proxy, it can be worth it. All right, I was going super fast because this is supposed to be a lightning talk, and I'm trying to kind of fit a lot in there. But does anybody have any questions?
Jennifer, I put one in the chat. And also, can you see my video or do you see a fence?
I now see your video. I didn't while I was presenting just because of the way that the presenter notes work, but I can see your video
well,
now.
I just turned it on. So
Okay.
I was just wondering about, I've traditionally used Wireshark because I've been in telephony and other information, like doing low-level stuff. And oh, what a headache for using the certificate, just like here with Charles, which is security stuff. But I was just wondering, is Charles lends itself better for Android development? Is that why better than Wireshark, or do you have an opinion?
I don't have an opinion, unfortunately. I've never used Wireshark, so I can't really compare them. I do say that Charles does work very well for Android development other than the setup. If you're trying to just see traffic, however, I would say that if you just want to see traffic and you don't want to do anything to it, that the tools that are built into just the Android IDE are quite good for just seeing traffic. But if you want to do anything, like Charles has all sorts of features with, it does things like breakpoints, and it does things like replacing with local, and it does map remote, and it just does a lot more. I'm not sure if Wireshark has all that functionality just because I'm not familiar with Wireshark.
Okay, yeah, Wireshark it has that, but it's like you got to do. It's so Swiss Army knife that it turns itself into being, very hard. So I could see that Charles is a very good use case to make itself very useful for HTTP traffic and working with Android. Cool, thank you for the answer.
No problem. I mean, it's hard to set up. Once it's set up, it's fantastic.
I had a question. I've run into the same kind of issues that you talked about, where sometimes you have to do it, sometimes you don't. Where do you think the flakiness comes from? Is it like an emulator thing, you think, or
I'm not sure, but I mean, this is just me guessing, but I would guess that I think it does relate to the emulator. I'm wondering if maybe the emulator does something weird with security because, just not being a real device, not working exactly the same. And of course, like I said, Charles is intentionally breaking security. So as Android changes, that's why every time, I get it working great, and then Android changes. I'm like, okay, now figure it out again, right?
Yeah.
But that's just completely me guessing. I'd say you probably know as well as I do.
Okay, cool.
Okay. If there are no additional questions, thank you everybody for coming.